Adrian fidgeted in his chair. "Can you feel anything?" Simon put his book aside and concentrated. He glanced at his watch. 2:30 a.m. Beyond the glow from the monitors, the gallery looked pitch black. There was utter silence. He felt suddenly cold. It's getting colder, isn't it? Yeah, down 2 degrees and dropping. Could be just ambient. What's the temperature doing outside? That's stable at 10 degrees, and has been since 11. When did this drop in here start? About 10 minutes ago. It's down from 18 to 15 now. Simon looked down both limbs of the gallery. Nothing to see. It could have been his imagination, probably was in fact, but he sensed a change in the atmosphere, as if something threatening had joined them. I can't feel much air movement, can you? Shit! What? Look at this! On the new monitor screen, recording change in electromagnetic energy, an orb, bigger than any they'd seen before, was hurtling down the longer limb of the gallery, straight towards them. It came from the direction of the old demolished Queen's apartments. Looking down the gallery, there was nothing to be seen. On the thermal imaging screen, there was a moving blob of color. It was dark blue, intensely cold. The orb would have been at its center. It came to a halt at the defunct door to the King's pew. Simon got no further because the air was suddenly full of sound. Banging like a flurry of fists against a door, amplified many times over. Adrian turned the monitor sound down. Yes, definite banging, fainter but audible. Adrian turned the volume back up. It lasted a long time. It was recorded at 15 seconds. In the following silence, it seemed to echo. And then came an ear-splitting shriek, a woman's scream, which reverberated everywhere. Without the monitors, it was still audible, like the wind moaning. It stopped as abruptly as it had started. Looking down the gallery to the left and right, there was nothing at all to be seen with the human eye. There had been a definite atmosphere, though, threatening, malevolent, but it was now waning. The ensuing silence seemed unnaturally profound. Adrian and Simon both sat there stupefied. They felt the gallery getting warmer. Simon cleared his throat, which had gone dry, and croaked, "Is the temperature coming back up?" "Yeah," was all Adrian could say. Nothing else occurred during the remaining hours of darkness that night, which, given the state of their nerves, was just as well. It was the most obvious manifestation either of them had experienced to date. They had fully expected nothing to happen at all. They had sat for the whole of the previous night and experienced what they expected, a big, fat nothing. They had spent a number of nights in alleged venues of hauntings before, experiencing nothing but an occasional creak from the building. They had seen orbs on a few occasions before, but you could count those on one hand, and never as intense as this one. They had certainly never heard noise as obvious as this, amplified or not. Normally, it was a question of persuading their overhyped imaginations that what they really had heard was not a ghostly gasp or a moan, but just some natural noise created by the fabric of the building. What they had just heard could not possibly have been a normal or natural noise produced by anything. They spent the 4 hours after the manifestation uncomfortably, especially when a book fell from the table and hit the floor with a loud bang. They both leapt about a foot in the air. Simon felt his hair stand on end. He had anticipated, in this research of his, finding no evidence for the existence of ghosts. That would fit his treasured theory that all manifestations described as ghosts or hauntings came from the brains of living people and not from any life beyond this one. What they had just witnessed was a manifestation that was either some elaborate hoax or that had been projected unwittingly from their own brains, which seemed unlikely to Simon. or was evidence that might suggest his theory was rubbish? Would they be able to play back what they just recorded? They wouldn't know until they got back to Adrian's lab and processed the tapes. Adrian had been shocked by the experience as well. Simon could tell from his face and his quietness. Typically, though, he made a joke of it. "Want to go home now," he said in a child's voice into the void of the silence after the screaming stopped. "Too tiny, too frightened." His voice echoed ominously in the dark, and Simon shuddered involuntarily. Dawn broke, tinting the gallery with subtle grey. As it pushed the darkness away, it pushed their atavistic fears away with it. They were eager to return to the lab with their recordings, but they had decided on an all-night vigil. They waited impatiently for full daylight, left the monitors to record any happenings in their absence, woke the night staff at their posts on the gate, and trundled back up the A3 to London before the rush hour had begun in earnest. Simon clutched the videos and sound tapes on his lap the whole way, unwilling to let go of them. What would they show? Would they show anything at all? They went straight to Adrian's lab. Adrian warmed up the playback machinery, which had been too cumbersome to take with them. He put the tapes into their players, and Simon held his breath. A flickering light, and then on the video screens, blank, black images. Shit, nothing. No, wait a minute. There was a glimmer of light in the background of one shot. It was them. Pale and faint in the reflected light from the monitor screens, they could make out their own faces. Disappointingly grainy, but just, discernibly if indistinctly, the videos were recording something. Adrian fast-forwarded the film, and suddenly their faces were getting brighter. He pressed a button, and they had a view of the orb rushing up the gallery towards them. Their faces were reflected in the increased light from the monitors. He pressed another one, and there was the orb after it had come to a halt, at very close range, with the door to King Henry's pew behind it. The colourful thermal imaging screen was showing the same thing as a purple sphere, and the surroundings were deep blue, cold as the Arctic. Adrian started fiddling with the close-up tape of the orb, running and rerunning it. "Can you see anything else on this shot, Doc?" he asked eventually. Simon squinted at it. The image was too grainy. Wait a minute. It may have been his imagination, but the whole coruscating sphere seemed to be projecting an image against the door. Indistinct, like a smoky shadow, but just recognizable as perhaps a human form, with its back to them, beating at the door with arms aloft. Well, it looks like the shadow of a hooded figure beating at the door. It does, doesn't it? Adrian sounded as excited as Simon. And listen to this. He switched on the audio, and perfectly in time with what might have been flailing arms, the thumping on the wood filled the room. It ceased abruptly. Moments later, their ears were assaulted by the woman's screams. They turned to each other in astonishment. That same afternoon, they had an audience of one for their film show. Alice had phoned Simon to find out what was going on, and he'd suggested she came to see for herself, an offer readily accepted. Adrian and he had spent the morning editing the tapes into one synchronous sound and vision entity. Adrian projected it onto a large screen with the lights down, a little theatrical maybe, but effective. At various points during the running, Simon heard Alice's sharp intakes of breath. Adrian ran it again in slow motion. Alice went very quiet. She remained very quiet after Simon put the lights back up. She was pale and seemed shocked. "Well, what do you think?" "You certainly recorded a ghost, haven't you? The question is, who is it?" "I'm sorry we can't improve the definition." "You mean the orb?" "No, not the orb. The young woman." Long, braided, dark blonde hair just released from its tresses, the coils still loosening, streaming down her back as she runs, half-dressed in a nightgown. Then, stopping at the door, thumping at it and screaming. You could see all that? Yes, couldn't you? We could see what we persuaded ourselves was a faint outline or shadow on the door, but it was too faint for those details. I thought it was a hooded figure, but you are sure it was a young woman with dark blonde hair? Absolutely. More a teenager than a young woman. I could see her quite plainly. And you could see her running down the gallery? Yes. Where was the orb? She seemed to be part of it. It seemed to be like a moving projector, projecting her image into the air. Why was she seeing things neither Adrian nor he could? But much more disturbing for Simon, what she could see was familiar to him. She was describing his nightmare. They were back in the gallery, and Adrian was reloading the recorders with fresh blank tapes. He collected the exposed tapes that had been covering the day in their absence. It was that darkness thing, Simon supposed. They had set up the vigils at night, despite the demise of Wilbur the American in daylight, because most of the archival material described manifestations happening at night. It is not easy to transfer from day to night as a change in work routine, but anyone connected with medicine and nursing has already got used to it, and so have ancillaries like Adrian. So settling down to work all night was not unusual. Settling down to work here was, though. The place felt so bloody unfriendly. No, not just unfriendly, Simon thought, actually frightening. He kept telling himself this was his imagination. Adrian and he were in a known haunted site, in a famous old palace. They had positioned themselves in the very place where most of the manifestations had been encountered. And it was dark. Who would not be just a little frightened? Innocent and inoffensive as the Queen's Gallery looked, many of the other rooms surrounding them did not. The great watching chamber and the great hall stank of power, grandeur, malcontent, striving and misdeeds. More than anything else, they echoed the abuse of power. The haunted gallery, despite its ordinary appearance, had the atmosphere of something else again. Despair, betrayal? No. There was something stronger, worse, and they'd already experienced and recorded something. So, were we happy and relaxed, Simon thought? Hardly. Were we going about our task in a professional fashion? He doubted it. He felt as if he was on the lip of an abyss, with charlatan qualifications quite incompetent for the task, determined to throw himself into the chasm because it would verify and justify his research. The atmosphere in the gallery was definitely darkening, becoming less and less friendly. But he was also stubborn, and if he was honest, just a little ambitious. Doc? Yep. Do you think Alice could be psychic? I don't know. Why do you ask that? Well, I had a gran once. I know, we all had grans once. I meant she's dead now. But she had what they called the gift. She was psychic, a clairvoyant. Used to be able to forecast the future, you know. She was a medium, too. Spirits, well, she called them spirits, spoke through her. She had what they called a familiar, a spirit guide, an old woman called Wenna, who had lived donkeys years ago. She could see things other people couldn't. In fact, if she didn't purposely tune out, she used to grumble that spirits of dead people never left her alone. But Alice hasn't said anything like that. She looked shocked by what she saw. Yeah, and frightened that we couldn't see what she saw, perhaps. So what are you getting at? Well, I just wondered if it wouldn't frighten her too much. What would happen if she spent a night in the gallery with us? Out of nowhere, Simon felt a sharp spasm in his guts. "We couldn't do that." His voice sounded shocked and fearful. "It would be unethical and possibly dangerous. We don't know what might happen, and nor does she." Okay, keep your hair on. I just wondered, that was all." They sat for a couple of hours, Adrian either fiddling with dials restlessly or with his tousled hair, and Simon tried to read a book. Not one word did he take in. He kept returning to the idea of having Alice here with them, and whether she really would see things they couldn't. The atmosphere was different that night. He felt they were being watched by unseen malevolent eyes, but felt that nothing was going to happen. Adrian obviously felt the same because he started talking in a quiet voice. "Doc, what are you going to do about Prosser?" he began. "I can't do anything about Gerald Prosser. Why do you ask?" "Because he's trying to do something about you, and I think you should watch your back." "What is he trying to do?" "He's trying to persuade the authorities that you are still unwell and unfit for work." "Well, he won't get anywhere with that, will he? We've been there before." And he would have to persuade them that Prof had made a mistake in allowing me back. "The word is that he's bypassed Prof and gone to the Board of Governors." "Telling them what?" "Telling them that you are unbalanced by your grief, that your research is a fantasy of your disordered brain, that Prof is in league with you because you are his blue-eyed boy, and is shielding you even though he knows you're too ill to work." Simon wasn't sure he could argue too much with that. "He says that he's being discriminated against by Prof and that you're receiving preferential treatment to his detriment." "What detriment?" "He says Prof supports your research and won't support his." "It isn't Prof who's refused to fund his research, it's the board." "Well, he doesn't see it like that. He thinks Prof has undermined his case with the board." "But that's nonsense, and he knows it. Gunning for Prof isn't going to help him with the board either." "Well, he's insanely jealous of you, and I think what we are doing now, or hush-hush and top priority, has made him flip. Actually, I think he's always had a screw loose. You know what they say, psychiatrists are as mad as their patients. Oh, begging your pardon, Doc, but the board will listen to him, you know." "Why?" "Because his uncle is a close friend of the chairman." Simon spent the next hour digesting what Adrian had said. Professor Geoffrey Hutchinson was hardly devoid of controversy himself. He held opinions about psychiatric therapy which were eccentric. He was tolerated partly because of his charisma and partly because his treatments worked, however unconventional they seemed. Whether he had sufficient support from the governors to resist a straight attack from a subordinate with a direct line to the chairman was a moot point. Prosser was talking through his backside, but Prosser's uncle might not know that. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. Dawn broke. They left their monitoring apparatus running and went to their homes to get some rest. Simon had difficulty getting to sleep. His mind was whirring with Prosser and Alice. It began with a loud thud. It sounded like a large axe biting deep into wood, though there was another element to the sound that was more sinister. It was as if there had been something softer in the path of the axe before it struck the wood, something muting the sound. Then there was another sound, of drumming, soft drumming. They were on a scaffold. The drumming was caused by the dying spasms in the legs of the headless body of a young woman. It was her shoes making the noise as they kicked repeatedly at the stage. There was blood everywhere. It spurted vigorously from the stump of her neck. The man holding the bloody axe reached beyond the block to collect something. He held it aloft, the young woman's head. He held it by a fistful of the dark blonde hair, sodden with glutinous bright arterial blood, and displayed it so they could all see her face. It had only just ceased to be a beautiful face. Now it was fixed in a hideous rictus of staring disbelief. Unblinking eyes of a startling green, and a mouth wide open in an O of shock, frozen in the act of an involuntary scream. His heart started beating wildly. The face was Alice's. He awoke abruptly, uneasy and sweaty again, and this time with palpitations. He looked at the clock. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Sleep became impossible. He couldn't stop seeing the tragic, gory face. Alice's face, sort of. It seemed to meld with the face of the ghost of the young woman running in the gallery. Where were these dreams coming from? He got up and showered and dressed. Tonight's vigil was scheduled to start at 8. Even though he felt foolish, he was going to phone Alice to make sure she was all right. That dream had felt too real. The cab dropped him right outside the restaurant. Its glazed frontage shone brightly into the street, every table and the bar visible from outside. It was the reason he'd chosen it. He didn't want Alice to develop any insight into his lustful fantasies by cramming her into some ill-lit, intimate alcove somewhere. He felt she would feel safe and unthreatened here, and he was relieved to see he'd arrived first, despite leaving the hospital later than intended. He ordered 2 glasses of his favorite white wine, an act of faith that she wouldn't stand him up, and positioned himself at the bar close to the revolving doors. He saw her long before she saw him. She came skipping across the street, bouncing hair and short floaty skirt. Amazing legs, but all of her was amazing. Intimidatingly beautiful. The euphoria he felt at seeing her alive and well started to evaporate as shyness flooded in. It was only a dream he'd had, not real life, for Christ's sake. This was real life, though. He'd asked her out, and she had accepted. Simon felt shy suddenly. What the hell did he think he was doing? Then she was through the door, and he was faced with one of her dazzling smiles and a breathless apology for being late, and he had no more time for misgivings. They perched together at the bar, and she accepted the glass of wine he'd ordered for her, with a slight smile. "Is this wine all right for you? It's a Sauvignon Blanc." His presumption made him feel awkward. Her smile broadened. "It's perfect, thank you." She looked round. A nice place. I haven't been here before." "It hasn't been open long, but I like the atmosphere and the bustle." "Looks fun." She looked at him. "How was last night?" He explained their blank night, and how somehow the atmosphere in the gallery had felt different, so that they weren't surprised that nothing had happened. "We don't know how often manifestations take place in any case. I had the strangest dream back at home, though, about the execution of Catherine Howard, I think." He wasn't going to tell her about the link to her. At this point, the young woman who was front of house came to lead them to a table towards the back of the room. Following her, he was interested to see how many swiveling male eyes followed Alice's progress across the room. So it wasn't just him, then. He had butterflies in his stomach. They had been there since he had phoned Alice with the invitation that morning. They had started as soon as she had accepted. Adrian and he had agreed a rota of day and night vigils, with a whole day and night off in between. Today was the day off, and Simon had spent a good deal of time pacing up and down, trying to pluck up the courage to phone Alice. He couldn't just phone her and say he dreamt she'd been beheaded. She probably would think that he was trying to terrify her. Anyway, he had another reason for telephoning. When he dialed and got the ringing tone, his mouth went dry. If she answered, he wouldn't be able to speak. The ringing tone was interrupted, and he heard her voice. "Hello? Hello, Alice?" "Yes. Alice, it's Simon." "Simon, how are you?" "Well, thanks." "Good. What can I do for you? No problems, I hope." No, no problems. Well, apart from dreaming that somebody beheaded you, he thought. I wanted to ask you something, though. He was so relieved to hear her voice that he found the courage and impulse to ask her quite a different question. I wondered, are you free outside your working time at all? There was a silence, which he felt the need to fill, because I would like you to tell me all you know about Catherine Howard, and I just wondered if I could perhaps take you out to dinner or something? There was another silence, then, yes. Was that genuine pleasure in her voice? She had sounded on the edge of laughter. Yes, on both counts, Dr. Carlyle. I have plenty of free time when not working, and I would be delighted to, be taken out to dinner. Oh my God, she'd just agreed to come out with him. When did you have in mind? She had asked. Tonight? A pause in which he was sure his heart stopped. I know, not much notice, but tonight would be fine. It would be lovely. He had been unable to settle down to anything at all after that. The table was small and round, and surrounded by other larger tables. He began to regret his choice, and found himself yearning instead for the privacy of a dim alcove in Rules, or somewhere like it. Background babble filled the air. Waiters and waitresses in long black aprons swished through narrow gaps between tables, almost too close together. Alice seemed delighted, though, and gave him a warm smile over the rim of her glass. Thank you for inviting me here. I like this place already. Well, thank you for agreeing to come out, and hopefully, here's to nailing a ghost. He raised his glass to her. They both sipped their wine, and her mouth made a little pucker of pleasure. Delicious. What is it? Pouilly Fumé, a Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire. It tastes, I don't know, almost flinty. Exactly. That's because its vineyards, and those of Sancerre on the other bank, have Kimmeridge clay in their soil. She looked surprised. Do you mean Kimmeridge clay, as in Kimmeridge on the Dorset coast? Yes. That black, oily, crumbly shale gives this wine its flavour. Submerges under the channel and resurfaces at the Loire. Her eyes twinkled. He suspected he was about to be teased. A wine expert as well. I don't know how, but with just an inflection you've painted a picture of extreme pomposity with me as the subject. She chuckled and put her hand on his. It felt like an electric shock. I'm sorry. I had no intention of making you feel pompous. I was genuinely interested. Do you know Kimmeridge? This was an area he didn't want to dwell on with Alice yet. This was rosy territory, and the touch of her hand had started all sorts of conflicting emotions. Oh, I spent some summer holidays on the Purbecks a few years ago. We rented a cottage nearby. Kimmeridge was good for rummaging in rock pools and evening barbecues. He tailed off. My favourite bit was round the corner. When the ranges were open, you could go round to the west. The best rock pools were there, where the rock shoots off out to sea in a great honey-coloured spur, the surface all worn smooth but lined like the hide of a gigantic elephant. She said this in a tone of happy recollection. Yes, I used to imagine it was a giant dinosaur asleep. Their starters arrived with a bottle of the wine. When the waiter had left them, he asked, "When did you go there?" "A long time ago with my parents. We rented a cottage in Studland for a month every summer." Kimmeridge made a welcome change from all that sand. That was before we moved to South Africa. You never know. We might have bumped into each other years ago without knowing it. Oh no, we wouldn't, he thought. An image came to his mind of a sun-tanned, coltish young girl, already with those long legs, her straight hair in bunches. No, I'm afraid not. My time there was a little later. If I had bumped into you as you were then, I would have been arrested. I don't think he would have been tempted to get arrested. I was skinny, gangly, and wore braces on my teeth. Did you wear your hair in bunches? She looked puzzled. His eyes must have looked teasing, because she looked discomforted for a moment. It didn't last long. Yes, quite often. She hesitated and then smiled. Why? Is that a fantasy of yours? No, it's just a clear image I had, that's all. Of me? Yes, of you. And you must tell me about South Africa. They were interrupted by the main courses arriving, and they were silent for a while. He had the feeling she was not going to talk about South Africa. Okay, take your foot off the gas, he thought. He studied her surreptitiously as they ate. Her hair was shoulder length, heavy and straight, and he was sure that's why he pictured it in bunches. They would have suited its glossy texture, as did her long feathered fringe. It emphasized her eyes, which he now saw change color within their green spectrum. At the moment, perhaps because of the light, they appeared more smoky grey than green. Her face had a very slight asymmetry to it, which he couldn't quite work out. A straight nose which wrinkled expressively, the lines radiating from the tip back towards the eyes, and the faintest dusting of freckles spreading onto fine, high cheekbones. She had a broad mouth with generous lips, which she puckered expressively around straight white teeth. That was what made him think she was French, he realized. Such features arranged symmetrically, he suspected, would have given her a doll-like, inanimate face. Hers could not have been more animated, and it was Gallic in its expressiveness. "Have you got any French blood in you?" he blurted out. She looked a little shocked. "Yes, as a matter of fact. Grandma on my mum's side was French. How did you know?" He squirmed inwardly. He hadn't intended to ask such a personal question. It had just come out. He couldn't tell her it was the voluptuousness of her mouth, and the way she pushed her lips forward when she spoke, almost in a pout. Nor could he tell her that he found the impulse to kiss them irresistible. Not yet, anyway. He stammered, "Oh, I just wondered, that's all. You have a certain way of speaking. It seems foreign. Attractive." She looked at him calmly enough, but she was blushing faintly. "I'm going to take that as a compliment," she said, "especially coming from an Englishman." It was meant as one, he said. She looked at him from beneath her lashes. "You don't look very English yourself, you know. You don't look like a doctor, well, certainly not like a psychiatrist." He grinned at her. "I'm going to take that as a compliment, too. What does a psychiatrist look like, then?" She grinned back. Grey-haired, careworn, very solemn, and very, very serious. She enacted a solemn expression which made him burst out laughing. It was an accurate cameo of one of the consultant psychiatrists from his student days, whom they nicknamed Eeyore. "Give me time. The grey bit is happening already. I'm not sure about the serious bit." "How did you become a psychiatrist?" she asked, her face questioning expressively as if to add weight to his ponderings, with such a strange, special interest. "I chose psychiatry because it seemed a discipline which had the neediest patients, and the least tools with which to help. I felt it needed all the help it could get. It occurred to me that there might still be an opportunity for pioneering, too. Psychiatry is still in its infancy, you know, to quote an old boss of mine. So the opportunity to try out new ideas appealed. Yes, I can understand that. You're altruistic and ambitious, then?" "Well, I'd like to think any ambition was altruistic, to help people, you know." He grinned ruefully. "But truthfully, I probably am a little bit ambitious for myself, too." She smiled back at him. "There's nothing wrong with ambition, if it's controlled. It can be a good driving force. What about the interest in ghosts, though? How did that come about?" "By accident. 5 years ago, a very disturbed 15-year-old girl was referred to me by her GP. Because he was also a friend, his letter was chattier than the usual referral letter, and he mentioned disturbances at the girl's home which were bizarre and which he felt might be relevant. I visited the patient at home, thinking my friend was probably talking about disordered family relationships, and blundered straight into a terrified family and the most florid poltergeist activity I've ever witnessed. The family believed the house was haunted by an evil spirit and blamed it for the disturbances and the girl's illness. I was frightened by the violence, but felt sure after a while that all the activity was created by the girl. I thought treating her psychiatric disorder might solve the whole problem. My hunch was correct, and she made a full recovery. The poltergeist activity ceased. Is poltergeist activity the same as ghost activity? Not really. The appearance of a ghost is not often associated with violence. It just appears, which can be terrifying enough. Poltergeist activity can be destructively violent to inanimate objects, like wanton vandalism, but tends not to be directed at people. People can be in the middle of a maelstrom of destruction with objects being smashed or flung around, yet remain unharmed. There are no ghostly figures involved in poltergeist activity. So where did your interest in ghosts come from? It occurred to me that ghosts and hauntings may have a similar origin to poltergeists. People? Exactly. That is my theory, and now all I've got to do is to prove it. But how many ghosts do you come across? They must be a bit thin on the ground, aren't they? Well, as it happens, my childhood home was haunted by a friendly ghost, or at any rate a harmless one. We all saw her, mother, father and I, at various times of day and night. She was a tall, elegant woman with a full skirt and a dark cloak. She made no sound, just flitted rapidly through an outside wall in our Tudor dining room, where there was no doorway. The funny thing was, we discovered that there had been a doorway at this point once, blocked up a couple of 100 years before. That's fascinating. So you've actually experienced something, really seen a ghost yourself. Alice seemed excited. She hesitated, as if collecting her thoughts while her mind raced ahead. But to pursue your theory, who was the person who conjured up your ghost? Well, I was only a child, so I didn't think about that. Years later, I decided that it must have been my mother. Strange things were always happening to us, and not just in that house. She attracted ghosts without wanting to, she used to say. She described herself as having extrasensory perception, able to experience things others couldn't. And did you believe her? Alice asked. Yes, he said simply. A look of relief passed across Alice's face, which had suddenly looked vulnerable and defensive, as if she expected to be teased. Good, because I think I have that ability, or disability too. He decided to grasp the nettle. Alice, I want to ask you something. Yes, go ahead. The other evening, when we ran the tapes and you saw much more of the manifestation than we did it frighten you? Yes, I've always felt sensitive to atmospheres in places, but friends have said I'm suggestible rather than sensitive, which isn't very flattering, so I've tried to dismiss such feelings as just my imagination and not talk about them. Well, you certainly saw more on that tape than Adrian or I, but you didn't make it up. We could see the same image, just much more faintly. That was what frightened me. And I don't think you're very happy in the haunted gallery even in daytime, are you? No, I'm not. But you have never experienced anything yourself in the gallery when you've been in there? No, just that atmosphere of despair. You felt the same thing. Yes, I did. I don't know. I wondered if you might have psychic powers you are unaware of. But you are aware of them. Do you think you could act as a catalyst for the ghost to appear more completely? She gave him a very straight look with those big eyes, which were looking very green again. What do you want me to do? She asked. Well, I wondered if you would consider joining Adrian and me by sitting in on one of the vigils. She looked down at her plate, and there was a long silence. Would it help you? She said eventually. I don't know. It might. He felt the premonition of danger return very strongly. Look, on second thoughts, forget it. We don't know what might happen. I can't guarantee to protect you if something does. He had neither previous experience nor certain knowledge of what was going on in the gallery. What was he thinking of? "Who do you think the young female ghost is?" she asked. "It has to be the ghost of Queen Catherine Howard, hasn't it?" "Yes, I think so. She's young enough, and legend has it that she was dragged screaming from the door to Henry's pew while trying to reach him to plead her case when she learned about the accusations made against her." "Did she succeed in reaching Henry?" "No, but there is a problem." "Why?" "Because only in legend does Catherine behave as her ghost does on the tape. Modern historians accept that Henry, on learning of Catherine's alleged adultery, used a hunting expedition as his excuse to leave Hampton Court. Under the pretext of hunting and staying overnight in one of the many hunting lodges in the park, he slipped away to London to an emergency meeting with his counsel. He never saw Catherine again. Leaving Catherine knowing it would be forever and leaving her ignorant of the charge against her? Yes, ignorant for a while. A night spent in a hunting lodge was not an unusual, informal arrangement, even without warning. More than one night's absence, though, would have been peculiar. So Catherine would not have remained ignorant of her fate for long. She would have known something was seriously wrong within a day or two. So the problem is that the ghost is reenacting the legend, but not the fact. Exactly. But who says which is fact? Well, there is documentary evidence to prove that Henry met with his inner counsel in an emergency meeting that same night. It was typical of him to have no direct confrontation. Despite his macho image, beefed up for the Spanish and French courts, and, of course, the Vatican, he was an abject coward, especially in dealing with his queens. He was equally squeamish when it came to his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and the execution of Anne Boleyn. He had no contact with either of them after deciding to jettison them. What a cowardly shit. But couldn't Catherine have done exactly what the ghost does, unaware that Henry was no longer in the palace? Yes, she could, but there is no documentary evidence that she did. Maybe the ghost knows more than the historians. She gave him that flashing smile. Quite possibly. The feeling he'd had when they had been in such close proximity in her office was there again. Despite only losing Rosie 18 months ago, despite being intimidated by her physical perfection and by the gaucheness it induced in him, despite his baggage, and not even knowing what baggage she might be bringing with her, and despite the fact that he hardly knew her, and that her eyes reminded him of Rose's, that smile did it. That smile was unlike anybody's he had ever known, and it seemed to be for him alone. He wanted to ask her again about any man in her life, but found himself unable to. He didn't want to provoke any awkwardness again. The meal ended all too quickly. He persuaded her to let him hire a cab to take them both, dropping her off first before taking him home. They sat side by side, and Alice's closeness in the dark intimacy of the cab played delightful havoc with him. They were quiet. A complicated one-way system prevented the cab from reaching her front door without a considerable detour. He made it wait while he walked Alice the 100 or so yards down her street. As they walked, she broke the silence. "I would like to join one of your vigils." And sensing that he was about to protest, added quickly, "No, listen, I really would. Sir Edmund wants me to be involved in the investigation. If you are right, and I am a catalyst, maybe we'll get a clearer idea of the ghost in the gallery." She stopped and reached for his arm, turning him to face her. Her eyes glittered. "Please, Simon, I have a feeling that there is more going on than the ghost of a poor, manipulated young woman." "What do you mean?" I don't know, but I can sense it. I sense evil in the gallery, something more than the ghost of Queen Catherine Howard. And I have a feeling of foreboding, as if one or all of us are in danger. Well, that's even more of a reason not to risk it. I'm not going to expose you to any danger if I can help it. He said this with genuine alarm. She smiled shyly at his show of emotion. But Simon, I need to feel involved. I don't want to just hang around passively waiting for something to happen. I want to help. Please let me. He thought for a moment. Well, let me think about it. I tell you what would be a great help in the meantime. Can you tell me more about Catherine Howard sometime soon? Our conversation veered away from her somehow over the meal. Yes, it was too distractingly flirtatious, he thought. I would love to learn more about her if she really is our ghost. I'll tell you more about Catherine Howard if you'll let me sit in on a vigil. That's blackmail, he said with a chuckle. Yes, it is, isn't it? She said. They arrived outside her front door. She turned towards him again. When do you want me to tell you about Catherine Howard, and when is the next vigil? I'd like to learn about Catherine as soon as possible. Are you free tomorrow? She smiled teasingly at his disingenuous tone. I might be, she said. And the next vigil? Adrian and I gave ourselves a break in our schedule, so our time clocks won't get too out of sync with the rest of the world, he said, not really concentrating because he was going to have to let her go soon, and he wanted to kiss her. So the next vigil is the day after tomorrow. And you'll let me join in? Do I have a choice? Do you want to waste a lot of time doing historical research about Catherine Howard? She grinned at him. No. Well then, thank you very much for this evening. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much for accepting. He leant forward to kiss her cheek, and she half turned towards him so that he kissed the corner of her mouth. It felt soft and cushioned and adorable. Good night then. Good night. I'll phone you tomorrow morning. When she closed her front door behind her, Simon returned to the cab feeling as if he was floating. Ridiculous to feel so elated at the prospect of seeing her again so soon. He hadn't asked her directly. He hadn't wanted any awkwardness to spoil the evening. But he had looked several times. She didn't wear a wedding ring. Where do you want to start? How about at the beginning, if you've got the time? Oh, I've got the time, I think, but I don't want to bore you out of your skull. She wrinkled her nose. Think of me as a blank sheet of paper. History was not a priority subject at school if you were heading for medicine. Science subjects were what the universities wanted. They were sitting in Alice's office. She had scurried around when he'd arrived, clearing a space for him to sit down, which meant lots of bending, stooping and stretching on Alice's part as she cleared piles of papers and correspondence from work surfaces and chairs. This flurry of activity showed off Alice's figure disconcertingly well, as she was dressed in a fashionably short, tight-fitting skirt and clingy jersey top. Simon smiled to himself as he recalled Adrian's last words when he told him he was going to a history lesson with Alice. Oh yeah, lucky you. Make sure you learn something. What do you mean? Simon had feigned innocence. Well, try and concentrate on the history and not on Alice Charrington. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, and I don't blame you. She's very distracting, shall we say? No, you can't say. Adrian had grinned cheekily. Okay, boss. And what have you got planned? He had stopped being cheeky. I've had an idea about how to tidy up our playback quality on the monitors. Get rid of the graininess. Improve the definition. We might end up being able to see what Alice can see. Seriously? Yeah, I think so. but it means I've got to go back to the lab and do a bit of tinkering. That okay? Sure. Simon was thoughtful. That could be very helpful. Yeah, that's what I thought, said Adrian. The first thing you should know about Catherine Howard is that she was a young, very young, member of the mighty Howard family. The second thing is that she managed, wittingly or otherwise, to ensnare King Henry into making her his fifth queen, and died, less than 2 years later, beheaded in the Tower of London for adultery. The truth behind the accusation of adultery, as with every other aspect of Catherine's life, is controversial. What do you mean? Alice pulled a face. Well, the accusation of adultery was retrospective and involved Catherine's alleged sexual activities before she married Henry, making a mockery of the term adultery. And so little is known about her before her marriage that her early life is the subject of either speculation or, worse, gossip. We don't even know how old she was, because there is no record of her date of birth. We know who her father was, Lord Edmund Howard, third son of the second Duke of Norfolk, and probably, because he was only a third son, comparatively of little influence, so little is known about him either. And we know who her mother was, Jocasta, which would be Joyce these days, Culpeper. Jocasta was blessed, or cursed, with fecundity. Lord Edmund was her second husband, and he inherited 5 stepchildren from her first, and she had at least 5 more by Edmund. We shouldn't be surprised that she died while Catherine was still very young. No doubt childbirth wore her out. Jocasta had been wealthy enough to provide a modestly comfortable upbringing for this massive brood, but not wealthy enough to stop Edmund complaining endlessly of lack of funds. So Catherine, at a very young age, had to be parcelled off to her step-grandmother to be brought up in her household. Was that a normal course of events for a girl like Catherine? It would have been, but usually girls were a little older when they were sent away from home. Her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, widow of the second Duke, was one of the wealthiest women in England, and ran a very large household, which moved between 2 rambling houses. One was at Horsham in Sussex, and the other was on the south bank of the Thames, opposite the King's new Palace of Whitehall, where the Royal Festival Hall and South Bank Gardens are now. It was quite normal for great families to provide lodgings and food for large companies of young, unmarried relations, to be trained, educated, and employed, to wait on the heads of their adoptive households. Catherine would have fitted into this hierarchy at quite a high level, however young, by virtue of her close blood relationship. She was, after all, a niece of the current Duke. The whole household lived together. Catherine was placed in the maiden's chamber, alongside lots of other unmarried young women. They all slept in the same dormitory room, and it must have been rather like a dormitory at a boarding school for girls, with a couple of significant differences. And those differences were? Firstly, a wide age range, from the young girls to mature young women. And secondly, unlike a girls' boarding school, there were also boys and young men covering the same broad age range to contend with. To make matters worse, the Dowager Duchess appears not to have been a conscientious headmistress. So what are we talking about here, St. Trinian's or a bordello? Probably a mixture of both. One of the acts of rebellion by the Maiden's Chamber, in fact one of its preoccupations, was smuggling young men into the dormitory for entertainment after lights out. She caught the flicker of recognition in Simon's eyes, at the easy familiarity with which she'd spoken the phrase. She wrinkled her nose at him and grinned. It wasn't quite Rodine, she said. Benenden. He smiled back at her. Not quite Eton. Sherborne, he said. So was there hanky-panky in this dysfunctional dormitory? Well, they smuggled food in and had midnight feasts to keep the men entertained, and I suspect that there was quite a lot of intimate fondling of an exploratory nature in the shadows away from the candlelight. Alice blushed faintly, a hint of rose on her cheeks. Her eyes slid from Simon's, and she gazed out of the window, as if studying something far away. If some of the other young women's testimonies are to be believed, Catherine was an enthusiastic participant in these dormitory games, and they hinted that matters got out of hand, culminating in full penetrative intercourse between Catherine and a distant older cousin, Francis Derham, on more than one occasion. With everybody else watching, Simon was genuinely shocked. The hint of rose intensified on Alice's cheeks. No, not really. There was little enough privacy, but they could draw curtains round their individual beds. Of course, when you can hear but not see, imagination can run riot. How old would Catherine have been then? That's what I find really shocking. I now think she was probably only 11 or 12. Christ, that's child abuse, isn't it? Was he just as young? No, he was a good deal older. In his defence, young women probably became sexually active early. They were often married at 12 or 13. Though whether they all indulged in or endured sex at such a tender age is unclear from birth records. So here is this young man having his wicked way with a girl. Boy and girl frolics getting out of hand and going too far because they both got carried away? Or something else? I suspect Derham's motives were not born out of love. Catherine would have been quite a catch. Derham was a much more distant relative, and much lower in the hierarchy of the Howard clan. If he persuaded Catherine into a pre-contract, a vow to marry at a later time, considered binding in Tudor England, then he had secured certain advancement for himself, courtesy of the Howards. So, a young chancer on the make? I think so, yes. Whatever the motive, it proved catastrophic for both of them. And Catherine was not entirely blameless, however young. She appears to have already seduced her music master, Henry Manox, allowing him intimate caresses, if denying him full sexual gratification. Whether this was sexual precociousness on Catherine's part, or more child abuse on Manox's, we cannot know for sure. Manox certainly abused his position of trust, but whether he was provoked beyond endurance we cannot know. These were allegations made while taking statements from her dormitory companions in the lead-up to her trial. Historians from a more morally rigid age have responded with shock to these documented tales of sexual lewdness and dismissed Catherine as a slut. Her reputation has been tarnished forever, but I feel inclined to look upon Catherine's behaviour with some sympathy now, perhaps even pity. A change of mind? No, just a more informed opinion. She blushed again slightly, and her expression became guarded. Simon waited for her to tell him. The young girl I made out on your tape was very young, much nearer 17 than the early 20s, other historians suppose, and that fits in with the group of historians who believe she was only 15 when she came to the king's attention. They have evidence to support their belief? She was not mentioned in the will of her mother's father-in-law in 1524, nor was her younger sister, but her older brothers were. However, she and her younger sister were mentioned in the will of his widow 3 years later. One group of historians believe that this doesn't prove anything, as they might have both been excluded from the earlier will because they were girls, not because they were yet to be born. The older siblings were all boys. There was no equality of the sexes in Tudor England. She hesitated. I was of that opinion myself, but recently the provenance of a portrait thought to be of Catherine, and giving a date of birth of 1520, has been called into question. It is now thought to be of Jane Seymour's sister, Elizabeth. So, although it seemed to corroborate Catherine's age as 20 when she came to Henry's attention, perhaps a more likely age for her florid sexual history, there is no evidence to question the assertion by this other group of historians who believe, based on the evidence of the wills, that she was born in 1525 or 1526, making her just 15 when she caught Henry's eye. Alice's voice became quieter, which makes what befell young Catherine Howard even more appalling. That's why I was so shocked by your tapes. Simon felt that he was suddenly treading on thin ice, and replied cautiously, I understand. Look, for me this is all virgin territory. I am not an expert in the supernatural or the paranormal. I'm just the only person researching it who has any recognizable qualifications. What you have told me is very helpful. I cannot explain what we have recorded on those tapes. We've never managed to record any aspect of any manifestation before. If it has changed your expert knowledge of Catherine Howard by reinforcing your perception of her young age, that's not all bad, is it? She shrugged her shoulders. Well, I can't stand in front of a group of historians and say that Catherine Howard's ghost would appear to be in her teens and not her 20s. So there you are. And what about you? Are you going to be able to submit your tapes and say, here you have the recorded ghost of Queen Catherine Howard running along the gallery, so ghosts really do exist, and this is the cause of the tourists collapsing? Point taken, Simon said, smiling. Still, it's the nearest thing to evidence we've ever had. Do you want to take a break? Why not? A cup of tea? All this lecturing has given me a dry mouth. She opened a door in the far wall, which led into a small kitchen. Simon joined her and leant against the work surface. If you've had enough lecturing, we can always carry on some other time, he said. No, I'll be fine after a cup of tea if you haven't had enough history for one day. No, I'm fascinated. Please carry on. Good. So where were we? Catherine's life in the household of the Dowager Duchess would have been but a step on the road to a place at court for a girl in Catherine's position. However slack a boarding school, and however lax the guardianship, she would have been groomed in the manners and etiquette required of a courtier in the presence of royalty, because as the Duke of Norfolk's niece, that was her rightful place. Sugar? No thanks, just a dash of milk, please. Alice's words had reminded Simon of Sir Edmund Pemberley, modern courtier. Had he been similarly groomed? There had been something slightly odd, almost sinister, about him, Simon thought. Was your boss similarly groomed, do you think? He is certainly suave enough. Alice gave him a straight look as if she thought he was fishing to establish the relationship between herself and her boss. He was, but he didn't think he'd been that transparent. She pouted. He's not particularly difficult to work for, but he is very aloof. I really don't know him at all. She moved back into the office. Simon followed. So, Catherine's place at court is dependent upon her uncle, Norfolk, a very wicked uncle, as it turns out. Wicked? How so? Utterly unscrupulous and ambitious. He was prepared to manipulate a young niece like Catherine entirely for his own ends. He would have considered Catherine a chattel to be deployed and disposed of at his whim. In fact, there was a precedent. Anne Boleyn was also a niece of Thomas Howard, and look what happened to her. So Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were cousins. I had no idea. Yes, and when Anne was convicted of high treason in a travesty of justice in a court of peers, accused without any evidence of incestuous adultery, not a great episode for the House of Lords, I'm afraid, her wretched uncle, in his capacity as Lord High Steward, had to pass sentence, and was so vindictive in his sentencing, recommending that Anne should be burned rather than beheaded at the king's pleasure, that his judgment was questioned by lawyers as being contrary to the law of the land and too harsh. He reacted with predictable arrogance, of course, incensed that mere mortals should question his judgment, and showed not one scrap of remorse about condemning his own niece to a hideous death. In the event, even the monstrous Henry had more compassion. This is the charming individual we are dealing with here. It sounds as if he felt an urgent need to cover his back. What happened next? Thomas Howard got wind of the king's dissatisfaction with his new queen, Anne of Cleves. The king could not stand the woman, was physically repulsed by her, and was pouring venom on the head of Norfolk's arch-enemy at court, Thomas Cromwell, the Machiavellian leader of the new reformist faction, who had arranged this disastrous marriage to further the reformist movement. Cromwell had been secretly ordered to extricate Henry from it. Henry was rumoured to be impotent, with Anne, and known to have a roving eye. Norfolk saw his chance. He had a pretty young niece at home, anxious to come to court, so he procured for Catherine a position as one of the new Queen's ladies-in-waiting, and waited, no doubt rubbing his hands with glee, at the prospect of his sexy little niece catching more than just the king's eye, and gambling that Catherine is alluring enough to overcome the king's impotence. With his niece as the king's mistress, he could imagine the demise of the reformers, the fall of Cromwell, and the resurgence of the old religion and conservative faction at court. And who was the preeminent conservative at court? Why, Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, head of the most powerful Roman Catholic family, of course. He would once again be the most powerful subject in England. He would crush that jumped-up, scheming ruffian Cromwell underfoot, kick that snake of an archbishop up the backside, and hurl that nest of vipers, the Seamers, back where they belong, among the turnips, as far away from London as possible. Surely Catherine would have been wary of trusting this uncle, and would she have been so malleable? She sounds quite headstrong. One of the enigmas about Catherine was she was so fiercely ambitious that she was prepared to risk it, so feckless that she neither knew nor cared about the risks, or so dutiful to her family that she felt she had no choice. We have no way of knowing. She certainly had ambitions to go to court, but whether they were drummed into her by her relatives or came of her own volition, we don't know. She would have been very aware of her place in society, proud, but unlikely to have been as arrogant as her uncle. Proud enough, though, to be cruel in the way she dismissed Francis Derham when he protested about her impending move to court. He tried to stop her? No, he couldn't do that, but he appealed to their secret love for each other, and said that he wouldn't stay long in the Duchess' household without her. She is alleged to have replied that he could do as he wished. In other words, he wasn't going to obstruct her advancement. So, presumably, in a state of high expectation and excitement, Catherine found herself at court, and of course she found herself in her element. Court behaviour was just like the Maiden's Chamber, only more so. The court consisted of all the big players of the day, all the privileged, all the wealthy, and many in the full bloom of youth. Men and women all jostling and flirting with each other, and especially flirting for the eye or ear of the king. And nobody was richer than the Howards, so armed with a sumptuous and provocative wardrobe, she was thrust under the very nose of the king. The court fashions in clothing for women still followed the French style, introduced by Anne Boleyn, involving lavishly jewelled bodices, skirts and separate sleeves of sumptuous materials and colours over a simple slip or chemise. The slips were of fine enough material to be transparent, and the bodices so low cut that the breasts were often completely exposed. The hoods were perched high on the back of the head, designed to flatter, held by a chin strap, and revealed a good deal of hair and brow. The old hoods, which had been as unflattering and as concealing as nuns' wimples, had long gone. Although there is no evidence to suggest that Catherine was dressed with any extreme of provocation, she was certainly dressed expensively and fashionably. Alice got up and went to a bookcase, speaking over her shoulder. One of the only known surviving portraits of her is a miniature, but it shows what I mean, especially the richness of her clothing. Money, of course, was no problem for her uncle and grandmother. All this finery beggared many courtiers' families, but not the Howards. She was reaching for the book when the phone rang, the modern trilling of a trim phone. She picked it up and turned to look at Simon as she listened. Her expression changed from polite inquiry to surprise, her eyes widening. "It's Adrian, for you. He sounds excited." "Doc, can you and Alice get over here now? I've got something to show you." The grainy picture had gone. Instead, the blackness was intense and even, with no static interference. The figure was clearly a teenage girl, almost a young woman, running down the gallery as if her life depended on it. She was only half-dressed, high nubile breasts clearly visible through the gaping gown, which she hitched up to her waist to prevent tripping herself up in its skirts. "A real blonde, as you see," Adrian said. Simon looked at Alice, but she didn't respond to the remark. Her eyes continued to stare at the screen. Adrian grimaced theatrically. "Sorry, just boasting." He flicked switches and the scene changed, obviously taken by a camera pointing back towards the great watching chamber. Suddenly a figure appeared, seemingly out of the wall. "It came from the entrance to the staircase," said Adrian. It had its back to them and was lumbering away from the camera. It looked to be male, from the breadth of shoulders and muscular calves, and Tudor from its clothes and cap. It hesitated, then halted, and looked back towards the camera, half turning to do so. Simon's blood ran cold, and Alice moaned audibly. Where there should have been a head and face, there was nothing. Just an empty space, with the fabric of the inside of the elegant hat. Simon felt his guts clench with fear. He felt the strange prickly sensation on the back of his neck as his hackles rose. He looked at Alice. She had gone white and her eyes were huge. "What do you think that's about then, Doc?" Adrian's voice sounded harsh. "I mean, what the fuck is that?" "Oh, beg your pardon, Alice." Simon found his voice, but it was as parched and strangulated as Adrian's. "I can't explain what that is any more than you can. I don't begin to know what that's about." "It's evil," Alice said in a breathy voice, "don't you think?" "Yes, I do," Simon said. "Well, my body certainly thinks so." "Yeah," Adrian said, "it did that to me too." "Please can you turn it off, Adrian?" Alice asked in a slurry voice. "I think I'm going to faint." And she did, sliding gracefully off the front of her chair.